Hi, I'm Mark Allen and welcome to another ATS News Special Report. Today we're in sunny Las Vegas with one of the best friends of ATS, of the famous guys that we know, a man of the highest integrity in journalism and I think as a human being. He's not only a friend of AboveTopSecret.com, I consider him a personal friend. He really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. 17-time Emmy Award winner, 1 Peabody Award, and recently inducted into the Associated Press TV and Radio Hall of Fame. The one and only George Knapp.
Hey Mark, good to see you.
Thanks for having us out, George.
Welcome to Las Vegas.
Why are we here?
Well, let's start with the premise. The premise being, is there a conspiracy involving the Department of Interior? Is the Department of Interior and all of its agencies co-opted by the very industries it is supposed to regulate? That department is supposed to take care of public lands, hundreds of millions of acres, on behalf of the public, and to regulate things like oil and gas, energy development, mining, wildlife on those millions of acres. Is it possible that the public served by the Department of Interior is not you and I public, but rather those industries I talked about? And I think the evidence for that is overwhelming. An example of that is the wild horse program. I've been covering this now for 20 years. What has happened to wild horses is an abomination. 100 years ago, there were 2 million of them roaming mostly the states in the American West. They were driven off cliffs, poisoned, shot, eaten, ground up for dog food, until there were very few of them left. And in the late 60s, early 70s, the American public said, we've had enough. There was a groundswell of support led by a Nevada lady named Wild Horse Annie, and the Wild Horse and Burro Act was enacted. And let me tell you about the level of support that this thing had. Congress got more letters about wild horses and the need for this legislation than any other issue other than the Vietnam War. Wow. This thing passed Congress without a single dissenting vote. And can you imagine any legislation, any act on any subject, other than maybe support the Flag Day or something, that could pass Congress now with complete support? It was totally supported by the American public, who said, we want to preserve the herds. We want them to live out on the public lands where they evolved, where horses were born, where the first horses ran across the plains. So they set aside more than 50 million acres as herd management areas where the herds could run free forever, presumably. Well, what's happened over the last 15, 20 years is that the horses have been decimated, not by predators, not by disease, but by our government, systematically destroyed. Of those more than 50 million acres that were set aside as herd management areas, 23 million acres have now been zeroed out. There are no horses on them. What there are on those acres are cows. Wow. And sheep. Basically, the BLM, which manages the public lands, is totally under the sway of big agriculture, meaning the cattle industry. And I'm not talking about small family ranchers out here in Nevada who struggle just to get by. I'm talking about big agriculture, which has the power to lobby for whatever it wants in Washington, and does, and exerts considerable influence over how the wild horse program is run. A program that is set up to preserve horses basically has ended up systematically eliminating them. There might be 20,000 of them left on public ranges, millions and millions of acres, and every year for the past 10 years, they've had these big roundups where they take them off the land, supposedly for the good of the horses and for the good of the land. They say, oh boy, these horses are running crazy. There's too many of them out there. They're starving. They're destroying riparian areas. They're eating the ground down to the nubs, and they're a threat to themselves and a threat to the environment. They've got to go. The reality is they take those horses off that land, they blame them for stuff that the horses don't do, because the reality is that horses are outnumbered on public lands 50-1 by not only other large wildlife, but mostly by cattle and sheep. So you take the horses off those millions and millions of acres, and invariably you let cattle go back out on there. Now people argue, well, horses are an invasive species. They don't belong here. You know, they're just stragglers that are they're ancestors of the horses that escaped from the conquistadors and settlers and things like that. That's a bunch of crap. Horses were born in North America. The very first horse species were right here. All of the 3 current horse species have their roots traced right back to here. They lived for millions of years on the North American continent and then spread to other parts of the world. When people came, they got wiped out. So and then they were reintroduced. They were reintroduced when Europeans came to North America. They were reintroduced. They belong here. They've always been here. This is the birthplace of horses. So for people to say, and many of those people are in the BLM, by the way, who say they're an invasive species, they don't belong here. They regard them as 4-legged, hooved cockroaches of the range kind of a thing, as vermin that need to be exterminated. And horses have really suffered. Right now, the American public is paying tens of millions of dollars every year, 3/4 of the BLM's wild horse budget, just to take care of horses and feed them in corrals. We gather them up off the range where they're living and happy and free, and we put them in these corrals, and then they are a burden on the taxpayer for the rest of their lives. It's ridiculous.
And that's on top of the money for the budgets for now when you say BLM, you mean the Bureau of Land Management.
Bureau of Land Management is what their official title is. A lot of people think that that's an acronym for the Bureau of Mining and Livestock.
Yeah. So on top of the budget that they're given every year to maintain and manage and be the stewards of these lands and by law these horses, that's not what's happening.
No, the lies that are told in this program are flat out amazing. They have this magic formula called AML, Appropriate Management Level. And it makes it sound like, wow, that really sounds scientific. They must go out and count the number of horses, and then they evaluate how much the land can handle, and they look at the foliage, and they look at the water sources, and then they come up with this formula. Well, I wish. The fact is, it's not only bad science that comes up with the AML, it's no science at all. Sometimes they have taken literally a boilerplate approach. Well, it worked in this area. We said X, Y, Z about how the horses were affecting the land, and they just use the same data in another herd management area to justify getting rid of the animals. Here's a perfect example. Calico, the Calico Range in Nevada. This is the most recent horse roundup that probably made news all over the country and that people would be familiar with. Calico, the BLM said the Calico Range, 500,000 acres. 500,000 acres in the middle of nowhere. The Black Rock Desert is around here. I mean, there is nothing there. The horses like it. They're not bothering anybody out there. But BLM says, oh, they've got to go. It's for their own good. They're not starving now. They're in good health, but maybe down the line they could be in trouble if the drought gets worse, so we better go get them. So they round up all these horses. They said, we think that there are probably, we can get 2,500 horses because they've got about 3,000 out there. Well, try as they might. You know, they went out and rounded them up, and try as they might, they couldn't come close to 2,500. The most they could get, and they caught every horse they could find. They got 1,800. So they were off by 30% right off the get-go. They also said, oh, don't worry, we'll take really good care. Now, we're doing it in the dead of winter when the ground is covered by snow, and that area up there is volcanic rock all over the range. We're going to do this in the dead of winter, run these horses for miles and miles over snow-covered volcanic rock, and that's a good idea. Oh, yeah, BLM said. It's much safer to do it in the winter, which, of course, begs the question, why did they do most of them in summertime, the roundups, if it's better to do it in winter? But we'll talk about that another time. They round up all these horses. The expected death rate of 0.5% was exceeded 8-fold. It was the bloodiest horse roundup in American history, at least that we know of. Foals, little foals, are run over miles and miles of this rock so bad that their hooves literally fall off and they die. A horrible, painful death. They take all these horses, they put them in corrals, and they leave them there. And the corrals, by the way, are on private land. And this is no accident. They build this facility. They allow the private landowner to take control of the horses, and because it's private land, they keep people like me off. I can only go there with an escort. I have to have permission to go there to see horses that are public property, taken off of public land with public dollars. They can bar people like me or wild horse advocates from seeing what's going on. The Calico example is sort of the program in a nutshell. They used bogus information to justify the roundup. They exaggerated the number of horses that were out there. They lied about the effect that the horses were having on the range. And here's the perfect proof for that. A year before the roundup, BLM sent an expert out there to fly over the range, to inspect some riparian areas, to evaluate the land. And the reason they wanted to do it is because they wanted to justify putting more cows out there. So she looks at the land, this expert, and says, I don't see any effects from horses. I don't see any overgrazing. This land is fine. Go ahead, bring in some more cows. 300% increase in the grazing rates. A year later, after the cows are out there, they find, hey, this place has gone to hell. We need to get rid of some horses, which is what they did.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Now, you interviewed some guys that were former employees of BLM, Bureau of Land Management. I want to make sure we get that name out there, Bureau of Land Management. And they quit in disgust. One fellow in particular, and we've got some video on him that we'll show you guys exactly what the man said from his own mouth. His name was Craig Downer. Give us a real quick, brief rundown about him, because we're going to show his own interview shortly.
Craig Downer is a wildlife ecologist. He grew up in northern Nevada watching the wild horses run across the range, fell in love with them, went to work for the BLM for a short period of time as a range specialist, studying water sources out on the Nevada ranges, public ranges. But he didn't last very long. He grew disgusted with the BLM because, in his words, I mean, they were totally co-opted by the agriculture industry. The horses are always the ones to go so that the cows can multiply. I mean, you know, to say that horses don't belong on the range where they evolved, but somehow cows, Hereford cows, belong there is ridiculous. I mean, cows didn't grow up here. There were no vast herds of Herefords roaming the American West 500 years ago. Anyway, Craig Downer is a very ethical guy. He has a master's degree. He loves horses and has studied them firsthand. And he says what BLM is doing is a systematic elimination of them for purposes of helping out agriculture.
Let's hear it, and let's hear it straight from Craig.
According to their environmental assessment, the wild horses are destroying the ecosystem and they're overpopulated. And that is such a distortion of the truth that even if I didn't care for wild horses, I would be very extremely upset at the misleading statements they're giving. And that benefits a lot of other wildlife.
Wildlife ecologist Craig Downer knows a bit about BLM tactics. He worked for the Bureau for a brief time, assigned to evaluate water sources in the Great Basin. He quit BLM because of what he said was dishonesty on the part of the Bureau regarding Mustangs. He put it this way in our first interview a few years ago.
It's very skewed data, very arbitrary statements. They'll come out and just state that the wild horses is a detriment to the ecosystem, and without presenting proofs. And a lot of very shady, secretive dealings going on.
To demonstrate the point, Downer and a colleague, Dr. Don Moldy, spent more than a week traversing most of the range targeted by BLM in its latest roundups. The duo drove and walked the backcountry, checking it out before the BLM gathers began, to see if the range and the Mustangs were healthy.
Nowhere did I see deterioration as the BLM is claiming, or if anything, there's an underpopulation of wild horses because we've covered hundreds of square miles and we've only seen one.
Eventually, though, they found more.
They look in good shape to me.
Including a couple of stocky Mustangs on a hillside south of Caliente.
Ah, beautiful horse.
Not only did the horses appear healthy, so did the range, says Downer. Urban residents can easily forget just how limitless the open range appears in much of Nevada. It stretches out forever. The BLM plan now being implemented is, to Downer and other advocates for the herds, an obscenity.
Totally eliminate all the horses, just zero them out. 11 herd areas that constitute almost 1.4 million acres. And at present there's only a scarce 620 wild horses in those areas. Yet they have the audacity to say that they're overpopulated. That is such a farce.
Essentially, Downer says, BLM has decided that one horse for every 2,200 acres out here is one horse too many.
It's obviously just an excuse.
3 Mustangs and dozens of their antelope buddies slogged around in a muddy depression on the enormous Tonopah test range in the summer of 2008. Just days after BLM contractors had captured and removed every other horse they could find, hundreds of them, in a roundup that BLM said was absolutely necessary.
There's basically no grass. The animals are eating brush, and after a while they go down in condition and die of starvation on the range.
To the untrained eye, the Tonopah horses sure didn't look like they were starving. That's because they weren't. The fact is, there's more than enough water and food for horse herds on this range, the very first range designated for Mustangs under the 1971 law. A mere 100 yards from the mud hole where Mustangs pawed for moisture is an oasis of foliage around the lush Clearwater Pond. The well that feeds the pond is operated by the BLM, which installed barbed wire fencing to keep wildlife out, especially horses. In the same valley, also on BLM land, water-intensive alfalfa farms operate. To our knowledge, BLM hasn't proposed any roundups of antelope to protect the herds that roam the same area. Critics allege the BLM has repeatedly engineered or otherwise contributed to the conditions on public ranges, which are later used to justify the removal of horses. Fences have cut the horses off from water and forage all over the West, which BLM then uses as a reason to round them up. Overall, BLM has gathered 250,000 horses off the public range, but what's happening now is different from previous years, both in scale and long-term intent, and it's happening with virtually no oversight.
And they're just saying, okay, we'll do what you want. We finally just totally cave in. And what the public doesn't realize is these greatly reduced herd management areas are already a very serious reduction. But now they're just going for broke, you know. They're just saying, yeah, I'll get rid of them.
There are many examples of BLM stacking the deck through the selective use of facts and images. In its plan for the Ely Gathers, BLM released a few select photos to suggest the range itself is in terrible shape because of the Mustangs.
To graze the plant.
Independent ecologist Craig Downer spent a week traversing the same range and found zero evidence of damage caused by horses. We did likewise. This hill in the White River Valley is one of the boundaries used for the Ely Gather. On one side of it is a huge reservoir fed by springs, so wet it produces oceans of cattails in the desert. But like other water sources in the area, it's off limits to horses. And on the other side of the hill is more water and more greenery. Grassy fields in front of a ranch. The ranch relies on leased public range as well, but all this is for cattle. It's a herd management area for horses, but now it's been cleared of horses because BLM thinks they can't survive here. Ranchers and the BLM often create hardships for horses by fencing off water sources or ranges. In 2004, BLM spent millions of dollars on an emergency roundup of horses in Nevada. Emotional photos were released of horses that died for lack of water, but horse groups took their own photos from a different angle. The dead horses were denied water because of fences, and on the other side of the fences, healthy cattle.
And George, you know, during that same period of time, or pretty close to it, you got to know and interviewed another lady named Cindy MacDonald. What can you tell us about her?
Cindy is a very feisty lady who just happens to love horses, and she was dismayed by the lack of oversight in the program. So she starts asking questions, calling up the BLM, writing them letters, trying to get information about some of these roundups, and trying to get the straight story about the reason for them. And what she found was she was stonewalled every step of the way, that either they wouldn't give her the information, or they gave her distorted information, or they lied about it. And so she started filing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and sort of became, over the course of a couple of years, something of an expert in how FOIA works, what the legal exemptions are, what BLM's responsibilities are, and she's compiled an incredible pile of documents about how that agency works, how corrupt it is, how it's completely co-opted by big agriculture.
And we're going to hear straight from Cindy herself, and we're going to make sure that we get as many of these documents that support every bit of what we're saying. Will be up on the site in links underneath this video. Hopefully they're there now. Let's hear from Cindy.
A lot of folks accuse us of catering to the livestock industry. The permittees that we have, the livestock permittees that we have over here in this area, they voluntarily reduced their numbers already.
Maybe so, but this preliminary report for BLM's Ely Roundup spells it out. Eliminating the Mustangs reduces the competition for livestock and other wildlife.
I know they're fudging the numbers, okay, just because of what the numbers are saying. You know, math is math.
Mustang defender Cindy MacDonald has, by necessity, become a freedom of information expert over the past few years, using the law to squeeze bits of information out of BLM. She says the Bureau is constantly changing its mind about the number of horses on the range.
It appears to me, from their numbers, that last year they had taken off between 11 and 14,000 more horses than was necessary.
MacDonald alleges that BLM has repeatedly lied to the public about the program, including the so-called emergency gathers.
Almost in all instances, the emergencies are fabricated.
She says the haughtiest and least reliable BLM honcho she's encountered is Nevada's Susie Stokey.
I think that she exemplifies the attitude among most BLM people in that they know best. We don't know what we're talking about.
We're doing everything we can.
And that the reason Susie has continued to climb the ranks is that she's good at it. I just can't believe that somebody in that kind of position can do such blatant lying.
And this last 3 days, without question, has been still in the hot air balloon.
Her bubbly spirit seemed way out of whack in light of the events leading up to our interview. We drove to northern Nevada to ask Stokey about the deaths of 70 wild horses on the Tonopah Range, apparently of nitrate poisoning. And while we were on the road to see her, 129 wild horses died horrible deaths at Palomino Valley, a facility that Stokey oversaw in her job as Nevada Wild Horse Director. More than 200 of the wild horses in her jurisdiction had died, but Stokey had sunshine in her heart.
It was awesome.
She was giddy because of the success of a horse adoption event sponsored by the Nevada office but held in Texas. Stokey is notorious among Nevada horse advocates for interfering with efforts to find adoptive homes for horses here.